Hey guys, welcome to this week's lesson. This is online lesson 6, where we are continuing with ultranationalism and propaganda during World War II. Before we begin, make sure you can review from last week. What types of propaganda techniques did ultranationalist governments like to use? So I showed you some examples of propaganda. So I want you to be able to identify, why they use these propaganda and were they effective. Also, who were the examples of ultranationalist governments I gave you during World War II? If you can't remember, go back to your lesson from last week and take a look. Our learning goals for today is to analyze propaganda used in Canada during World War II and examine the effects of ultranationalism in Canada on Japanese Canadians. So we've talked lots about propaganda in Russia, in Germany, even North Korea, but today we're going to look at from what was happening in Canada. Remember, ultranationalism is an extreme form of nationalism. It may cause people to use violence against others. It's often associated also with racism and discrimination. And ultranationalism was happening in Canada as well. In 1939, at the start of World War II, Canada declared war on Nazi Germany. Prime Minister Mackenzie King said Canada needed to unite in a national effort to save from the Nazi destruction. Canada focused on encouraging its citizens to support the war, and they did this by using propaganda. You can see a poster here. It says, "Come on, Canada," like you have to join me in order to go fight. The Canadian government used radio and newspapers to help convince citizens to help out in the war effort. This meant people were asked to help in factories, military, or even by using less resources or eating less amounts of certain foods. So a lot of women at this time who were not known for working in factories and in trades became electricians and engineers and plumbers because a lot of the men went overseas to fight. It asked everybody in the country to help out in a war effort. So I want you to think about this poster here. What do you think the message of the poster is? It says attack on all fronts. Canada used something called conscription. Conscription is when a government requires its citizens to join the military. Canada had used conscription during World War I, but that had made a lot of people angry in the country. They weren't sure if they should be required to have to join the military. So Canada asked its citizens if they were willing to fight for their country in World War II. Over 60% of the voters agreed with conscription, although a lot of French-speaking voters did not agree. Do you think it's acceptable for countries like Canada to use propaganda during times of crises like a war? Why or why not? Is it okay for propaganda to be able to convince people to do certain things for their country? The poster here, for example, says, "Your chums are fighting. Why aren't you?" So it's kind of blaming people for why aren't they helping. It's trying to convince you or almost use like a public shame to get you to try and join. During this time, there was something called internment camps in Canada. Canadians, there was a lot of ultranationalism going on, and that had led to racism and discrimination of certain Canadian groups. So for the most part, white people would have been okay. But Canada also started fighting Japan in World War II. And that meant that any Japanese Canadian people were often treated discriminatory. Canadian propaganda started to show Japanese people as the enemy, even if they were Canadian and born in Canada and lived in Canada for their whole life. Thousands of Japanese Canadians and also of German Canadians were sent to prison camps called internment camps because Canada was worried that they were spies. So imagine if you're a Japanese Canadian teenager living in Vancouver. Maybe you're born in Vancouver, you speak English, you've never even been to Japan, but the government is thinking you might be a spy because of the color of your skin. And they were put onto trains and sent to these camps away from the big cities or away from the coast. I've got a couple of videos that will go over what Canada was doing at the time and the impacts it had on Japanese Canadians. Watch the video on slide 9 and on slide 10. I find it really sad because a lot of Japanese lost their homes and they lost their land in Vancouver and Vancouver Island, and they never got it back after the war. And a lot of those places would be worth millions of dollars today. You can see on this map here where there were internment camps. There was a bunch in Alberta, and most of them were in British Columbia. You can see if you've ever been to Jasper or Banff, there were internment camps there as well. Take a look at this propaganda poster on the right, which is drawing a Japanese man attacking a white woman, and they've drawn him more like an animal than of a human. Even look at his nails, his teeth, his eyes. You can see there's a lot of racism in these posters. Joy Kagawa was a Japanese Canadian who, when she was a little girl, was taken and put in an internment camp. And she wrote a story about what it was like on her family's experience to be sent to these camps. You can read a little bit about her backstory here. This is from your textbook. And I want you to go through the cartoon story that I've provided here. Look at the slides and read the text at the bottom, which will give you an idea of what Japanese Canadians were going through. I want you to imagine what it would have been like if you and your family were going through this just because of the color of your skin. I'd also like you to click on the link here, okay? And you're going to take a look at a timeline of Japanese Canadians being interned. And I want you to answer the question in your assignment, what were the living conditions like for Japanese Canadians at these camps? These weren't nice hotels with room service and pools. They were usually very bare bones and in places that became very cold with not a lot of heating. So the last part of your assignment is going to ask you to look at two different pieces of propaganda posters, and I want you to think, in your opinion, where would you place the propaganda poster on the spectrum? So, for example, is this poster here with this woman and her child? She has on one hand a Japanese emblem here and a Nazi emblem here, kind of attacking her from both sides. Would you place this on a nationalism or somewhere in the ultra-nationalism range? And if wherever you place it, I want you to explain why. You might need to define nationalism and ultra-nationalism for me. Once you've gone through your slides, I'd like you to complete online lesson 6. I've given you your slide numbers, and I also have given you the link that you can go to for the timeline. Your assignment will ask you to read the cartoon by Joy Kagawa, and then I've given you your two propaganda posters at the end, and I want you to say where on the spectrum you would place these. Is it just nationalism, meaning just loving your country, or is it ultra-nationalism, forcing you to do things of violence or discrimination in the name of protecting your country? I know you guys can do a great job on this. This will be due 1 week after I've posted it. So please let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you at our online meet. Take care.